So you want to know more about how the Latter-day Saint tradition has evolved in their views on the Book of Abraham, especially the relationship between the scriptural text and the papyri upon which it was allegedly based. Last week, I did a video on the creation and canonization of the Book of Abraham. I discussed how Joseph Smith acquired the mummies and the papyrus, how he went about his claim translation in Kirtland, how he added revelatory additions in Nauvoo, and how that text was later canonized decades later through a fascinating process. But while many assumed that the papyri upon which the text was allegedly based was destroyed in the Chicago fire in 1871, its discovery in the nearly a century later raised lots of questions. Why doesn't the text that Joseph Smith produced match the text on the papyri itself? Are we still missing key portions of that papyri? And was the papyri merely a launching pad for Joseph Smith to dictate by revelation this ancient text? And how do you defend that as a book of scripture? I hope to explore some of those questions in this video. I'll talk about the moment when the papyri was discovered and how the LDS apologist Hugh Nibley modeled one form of a response, and then I'll talk about how LDS apologetics have evolved since then, both claiming missing portions of the scroll or talking about the antiquitous elements found in the text itself, or one of the more recent apologetic claims, what's known as the catalyst theory. But before I jump into all of that, I do want to give a few qualifications. I am not interested, as a scholar of religion, in trying to prove whether the Book of Abraham is scripture or historical or a fraud. I'm instead emphasizing how these texts are used, either to critique either to defend religious ideas and canonize and sacralize a text, or how it's critiqued by those who are denouncing a faith. And because this is part of my Friday series, the So You Want to Know More About X series, I am foregrounding the documents, providing both quotes and links in the video description so you can dig into the sources yourself. And finally, I want to emphasize again that I'm not an expert in the massive and debated world of Book of Abraham literature. I'd like to think I'm an informed outsider, and I'm trying to summarize, but I may get things wrong. And if so, please leave the corrections in the comments. And most importantly, I hope this is a springboard, a catalyst, if you will, to go and research it yourself from the various different types of sources I am mentioning, those both defending the Book of Abraham as ancient scripture and those who are critiquing it. So that's enough throat clearing. Let's get into the topic at hand. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, most people assume that the documents, the papyri upon which the Book of Abraham was allegedly drawn, had been destroyed in the Chicago fire in 1871. Emma Smith and Louis Bideman sold the material to a collector named Abel Combs shortly after Lucy Macksmith's death. Lucy Macksmith, as I outlined in the previous video, was really the custodian who took pride in it, and when she was gone, they sold it to whoever was interested. And it is true that some of that portion was then passed along further to a Chicago museum known as Colonel Wood's Museum. Here's a photograph of Colonel Wood's Museum in Chicago. That was then suffered, like most of the city of Chicago, a fire. Here is a portrait of the museum in ruins. But that was not the entirety of the collection. In fact, a lot of the collection, including the important papyri that's going to be the subject of today's discussion, was actually passed on to Abel Combs's housekeeper, Charlotte Beneke Weaver, who then passed it on to her daughter, who eventually would live in New York. And over a series of decades, the New York City's Metropolitan Museum of Art was had lots of conversations and was eventually able to acquire those documents in 1947, the papyri, not the mummies. And then in May of 1966, the University of Utah professor Aziz Atiya, who is a very influential figure originally from Cairo, shapes a lot of American and British scholarship on the ancient world, wrote church leaders that, hey, the Met Museum has these important documents connected to the Book of Abraham. He wasn't a Mormon himself, but he recognized facsimile 1, and most importantly, these documents identified themselves as connected Mormonism because many of the papyri are pasted on paper, on the back of which you find the Kirtland Temple. And most importantly, the Metropolitan Museum itself knew that these were Joseph Smith's documents. It's actually likely that Atiyah, who would go around talking about how he discovered these records, was exaggerating his role. The Met knew from the very beginning that these are the papyri that was passed down from Joseph Smith. And at one point, they actually asked him, hey, quit telling your exaggerated versions, which is actually a good example that often gets happen where historians often emphasize, I discovered these documents, when in reality, archivists and librarians knew about these documents all the time. But that's a rant for another day. But the main part of the story, however it comes about, David O. McKay, the president of the church, learns about these papyri's existence in 1966 through Professor Atiyah. His diary entry for June 3rd includes of their receiving a letter, learning about it, and then deciding to research it more. And this discussion takes place for the next year before eventually the church acquires them in November 1967. It's one of those deals where someone purchases the documents and then donates them to the church. Here is an image from the Deseret News when First Presidency Counselor N. Eldon Tanner and Dr. Atiyah are receiving the documents. And it's at that point that the church assigns Hugh Nibley, one of its foremost apologists, to research them. And of course, lots of questions come next. Before I go much further, the necessary pitch for this channel: if you enjoy this type of material where we use the past to understand the world around us and how we got to this point, please make sure you are subscribed. I typically do 3 videos a week, deep dives on specific topics and people every Monday, connecting the past to the present on Wednesday, talking about news, pop culture, politics, movies, what have you. And then on Fridays, I pull back the curtains on the historian's craft, either interviewing authors of new works, looking at classics in the field, or, as in the case here, looking at the sources behind historical arguments, providing you the links and the quotes and the documents so that you can refine your own historical tools. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the wave of people who have chosen to give back in recent weeks, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get icons next to your name when you leave comments, you get to ask questions that I might answer in future mailbag issues, and most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing, rigorous scholarship. You can find me on other platforms: TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. You can subscribe to my free Kit newsletter where I send out links and announcements. All those links are found in my video description. And this coming Monday, August 31st, I am doing my monthly live Ask Me Anything. This time I will be having on a guest, Dr. Kristen Kobus-Dumais, the New York Times best-selling scholar of the book Jesus and John Wayne, which is a phenomenal book, has a brand new book coming out in a few months, Live, Laugh, Love, the White Christian Women and the World They Made. I've read through it. It's fantastic, and Mormons play a crucial role. So I'm having her on my channel for a live chat about the book. You can come ask your questions. So please mark your calendars for Monday, August 31st at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Again, Monday, August 31st, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. It's going to be a lot of fun. But speaking of fun, let's get back to the Book of Abraham. So when word crept out that they now had possession of the Joseph Smith Papyri, these documents that were allegedly the origins of Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham, there was lots of excitement. Many said that this would be as if discovering the gold plates upon which the Book of Mormon was based. But there was a problem that they immediately had to confront. And that's this papyri that was in Joseph Smith's hand that they assumed was the origins of the Book of Abraham did not match the text that Joseph Smith then translated, the word he used, into the Book of Abraham. Now, I should note that this is a question that had been raised since the original production of the Book of Abraham. Remember that along with the text, Joseph Smith produced 3 facsimiles, and there have always been Egyptian scholars who are like, hey, those facsimiles don't say what Joseph Smith allegedly said. So these aren't brand new issues. But now when they're looking at these papyri that Joseph Smith had preserved, they displayed, they seem to have a connection to the Book of Abraham. They do not have any overlap in text. Instead, they contain the funeral text known as the Book of Breathings and the Book of the Dead. And there's no references to Abraham at all. In fact, they date during a period that would have been centuries after Abraham would have existed. So what do you do? Well, Hugh Nibley, who was the church's foremost apologist, go back and watch my video on Nibley if you haven't yet. He was an expert in languages. He was quite brilliant, regardless of whether you see him as an apologist and a crank or a devout religious dogmatist. He wasn't an expert in Egyptian, but he took his sabbatical year, which happened to overlap with the year of the discovery of these papyri, to go to the University of Chicago and study Egyptian language so that he could become a translator himself and produce his own work. And the church was worried. Once the church realized this problem, that the papyri does not match the text of the Book of Abraham, there was discussion to just not make it available, that this raises too many questions. And to Nibley's credit, Nibley convinced them that no, we should make it available. We can defend it. Transparency is the best approach. So at Nibley's suggestion and support, the church actually published a series of photographs of these newly discovered papyri in their own magazine, The Improvement Era, in February 1968. Here are a few images you can see from that magazine. And then Nibley went on to start offering some defenses, some arguments, laying the groundwork for what the church apologetic would be. I was specifically struck by one essay that he wrote for Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. Yes, he wrote for that liberal rag Dialogue. Nibley is such a fascinating persona. Again, go check out the video if I haven't yet. He titled it Phase 1 because he emphasized that we are going to be learning a lot. This does not confirm any basic assumptions. Instead, it opens up more questions. And this is how he puts it. And note here how he is laying the groundwork for a variety of different potential apologetic responses. Quote, "The investigation of the Book of Abraham has still far to go before we can start drawing significant conclusions. Even the first preliminary stage of the operation is by no means completed, for we still have to determine exactly what the relationship was supposed to be between the official text and the Egyptian papyri in the possession of Joseph Smith, and how Smith treated the papyri. The problem of Joseph Smith as an inspired prophet never enters into the discussion at all, since that lies entirely beyond the province of scholarship. The experts must judge him as a translator or not at all. But translator of what? While he freely circulated reproductions of the 3 facsimiles with his interpretation of them, inviting comments from one and all, he never specified what the particular papyri he was translating the text proper or by what process." Now, there's a lot going on. Those who are critical of the church or take a naturalistic approach are obviously going to have enough grist there to make hay that, yes, of course, this actually says a lot about Joseph Smith's skill and his position as a prophet. But you notice he's opened up the framework that we don't know what the text of the Book of Abraham directly goes to. We don't know what the direct correlation is. But he does close the essay with saying that one thing we do know about the ancient origins of the Book of Abraham that is a more persuasive approach than trying to connect the text to the scrolls and the papyri. Quote, "There is really very little new here to shed light on the Book of Abraham. We must look elsewhere for further light knowledge. For after all, the Book of Abraham does have something to say, and that should be the point of departure in any serious investigation of its authenticity. Here we have instructed parallel with the Book of Mormon, in which he goes on to argue that the text itself of the Book of Abraham has enough connections to the ancient world that in its own right should be seen as the apologetic." Now, he would go on to make another series of arguments that the text can have double meanings. The papyri, in other words, it could have on the one hand a surface level reading of these funeral texts, but the secret meaning below can be divined by a seer, and that Joseph Smith's scripture, regardless of connecting to any surviving papyri, had roots in Abrahamic world. But through all of this, he's laying the foundation for a variety of different potential trajectories that apologists could and did take in the ensuing decades. So while I could emphasize a number of apologetic traditions that have stemmed from this, I'm going to focus on two, and these two aren't in conflict. In fact, they often worked simultaneous and together. The first is the missing scroll theory, the argument that the portions of the papyri that had the Book of Abraham text was indeed destroyed in the Chicago fire, that the material passed on from Emma Smith and Louis Bideman to Abel's collection. Some of it went to Abel's family and is preserved. Others was destroyed in the Chicago fire. And so the question is that there are distinct sets of documents here, and we may not have all of it. Some who have studied the collections estimate that the batch that was preserved was only 11 out of 30, and one LDS apologist, John Gee, argues that the fragments are at most 13% of what Joseph Smith had. And to be clear, there is evidence that there was papyri that did go to the Woods collection in Chicago that was destroyed. And this gets into a lot of technical details of what's a scroll, what's a roll, whether the material that was mounted and placed behind glass and presented to the public, was that the portion that Joseph Smith translated, or just what was seen as the very photogenic, what we would call, or it just looks cool. However, there's also plenty of contemporary evidence by those offering countering claims that say that no, these are the papyri that Joseph Smith used. He talks about a symbol looking like this, and this is that symbol in the document. Others use mathematical calculations to prove key portions of the papyri are either missing or never existed, using complicated charts, setting up key words of the 1830s with what we have. In other words, there's lots and lots of complex, dedicated argument that in the end, it's going to come down to religious choice. Those who want to believe that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham and that it was a literal translation from an ancient text, they're going to have enough evidence to claim that, well, we're missing that portion that Joseph Smith translated. And those who want to take a more naturalistic account are going to be like, yeah, that's wishful thinking. What we have was what Joseph Smith used, and that's that. And I will also add, as a historian's perspective, I often think people, sometimes on both sides, are trying to read too much into these documents and expecting these offhand accounts from visitors in 1830s describing what they saw in the documents, taking it a bit too literally, bearing a lot more weight than what those documents can actually wear. The second apologetic approach that goes alongside, can go with or separately from this missing scroll theory, is just emphasizing the ancient connections of ideas found within the Book of Abraham. In other words, arguing that the resulting text, regardless of where it came from, show evidence of an ancient source. They often reference things like the text use of Chaldea, or the facsimiles mention of the idolatrous god Elkanah, things that they argue would not have been in common knowledge in Joseph Smith's day, but have since been vindicated by research into the ancient world of Abraham. So for instance, I'm going to link in the video description. By the way, I've linked to several of these key sources, the Improvement Era articles. Hugh Nibley wrote a number of important articles that he eventually refines into a book in 1975. But here's another key source that represents this apologetic strain, an essay from Daniel Peterson that appeared in the church's magazine, The Ensign, that says this, quote, "While a prayerful reading of its few pages allowed the Spirit to bear witness of the Book of Abraham's divine origin, the book has often been a focus of criticism for those seeking to find some error in the work of Joseph Smith. And yet, as the world's knowledge of antiquity increases, as scholars probe ancient non-scriptural texts that have come to light during the past 150 years, the Book of Abraham receives intriguing support. There is a variety of evidence illuminating the book of Scripture given to us through the prophet." Now, apologetics typically operate on a particular plane and make certain arguments that are going to serve a particular purpose. These arguments will typically not succeed at, nor are they designed to, convince those who are skeptical and outside of the LDS tradition. Instead, they're meant to reaffirm positions of faith from those within the tradition, or in the way that Dan Peterson and others will put it, provide a rational defense to remain a believer. So in other words, that what they're presenting is not going to be seen as convincing evidence to those who are already outside the faith. But these two trajectories, either arguing for missing scrolls that the Book of Abraham would have been translated from, or emphasizing the antiquitous ideas found within the text itself, that turns out to not to be the only way that Latter-day Saints have come to define and defend the Book of Abraham. Because in recent years, a number of LDS scholars, including believing scholars, have offered a competing theory that rather than a direct translation of an ancient source, the Book of Abraham should instead be read as a revelation. And they'll point to some of Joseph Smith's early teachings about the Book of Abraham, including some quotes that I mentioned in my previous video. So, for instance, from a September 1842 essay from Joseph Smith in Times and Seasons, which refers to the Book of Abraham as a revelation. In other words, saying that the papyri was not a literal text that was translated by Joseph Smith in the traditional way, but instead it was a springboard or a catalyst to Joseph Smith then presenting an idea of revelatory truths in the form of Abraham. Now, the big question that comes out of what is known as the catalyst theory is, does it matter what Joseph Smith thought on this issue? Because the historical record seems rather clear that Joseph Smith thought, even if he refers to it as revelation, he thought that it was a literal record in the name of Abraham. Or if you're a critic and taking a naturalistic approach to Joseph Smith, that he is presenting it as a literal record from Abraham. But there have been some Latter-day Saints who argue that even if Joseph Smith was naive or wrong in how he viewed the text, that he still was producing a text that had scriptural value, even disconnected from its historicity. Now, I'll highlight just a few people who embody this approach. David Bockavoy, who was a Mormon biblical studies scholar at the time when he produced the book with Cofford Books, authoring the Old Testament, presented this framework of seeing the Book of Abraham as inspired pseudepigrapha, placing it within a longer tradition of writing ex-canonical works that may not actually fit into a traditional corpus of scriptural teachings, but still includes truths. In other words, it may not be historical, but it still has scriptural ideas. And representing this trend is the Mormon studies scholar Terrell Givens, who, with the assistance of Mormon Egyptology scholar Brian Haglund, wrote in their book on the Pearl of Great Price this about the catalyst theory. And this is a bit of a long quote, but I think it captures this idea quite well of why some Latter-day Saints have come to take this apologetic approach to the book. Quote, "Invoking such a catalyst theory of revelation may empower the believer with a more accommodating model of Smith's seership, even as it strikes a skeptic as evasive. The value of such a possibility, however, is that it brackets the question of historicity and accuracy altogether, and enables a new range of questions to emerge. Instead of evaluating Smith's work by looking back through the lens of contemporary Egyptology, we may learn the workings of Smith's prophetic imagination and his own unique cultural moment by entering more fully into his 19th century context. By doing so, we move the question of seership and translation out of the domain of linguistic proficiency altogether." So you can see the value that would come from that type of approach in defining Smith's translation that can be separated from whether it does or does not reflect an existing or missing papyrus scroll, instead seeing the worlds that revelation then created. And if you want an academic approach that reframes how Joseph Smith is seeing these production of ancient texts, I also strongly recommend Samuel Brown's book, published by Oxford University Press, titled Joseph Smith's Translation, The Words and Worlds of Early Mormonism, that similarly argued that when Joseph Smith is talking about this type of translation, there's a cultural production value that sometimes gets lost when we try to fit it into these various categories. And that book is not offering an apologetic defense of the Book of Abraham as scripture, instead trying to approach as a cultural scholar the historical context in which Smith would make such claims. So then that brings us to, what does the church say on this as an institution? We see what the apologists are saying. You can imagine what the critics are saying, but how does the institution come down? Well, we can see the church's current iteration in one of their gospel topics essays. I did a video over a month ago on the creation, production, and reception of these gospel topics essays. Go check that out if you haven't yet. But on July 8th, 2014, they published Translation and Historicity of the Book of Abraham. And I'm going to walk through several of the key quotes to show how the institution has, at least tentatively for the moment, tried to address these issues. Here's the overall framing that you can see makes sense given everything that I've outlined so far. Quote, only small fragments of the long papyrus scrolls once in Joseph's possession exist today. The relation between those fragments and the text we have today is largely a matter of conjecture. So there, in those two sentences, we're already seeing the impact of both the missing scroll theory, that we don't have all the papyri, but also opening up the question that even if we had that papyri, we're not sure the exact relationship, or how we should define the relationship of the text and the original papyri. And in fact, the essay goes on to admit that there are diverging opinions even among believing scholars. Quote, Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint Egyptologists agree that the characters on the fragments do not match the translation given in the Book of Abraham, though there is no unanimity even among non-Latter-day Saint scholars about the proper interpretation of the vignettes on these fragments. I will note that's probably overstating things a bit for the non-LDS interpretation, but that's a topic for another day. The essay then goes on and offers a robust defense of the missing scroll theory, that we don't have all the records, so it is possible that there are papyri records that have the text that Joseph translates into the Book of Abraham. But then it goes on and also offers a robust defense of the catalyst theory. Quote, alternatively, Joseph's study of the papyri may have led to a revelation about key events and teachings in the life of Abraham, much as he had earlier received a revelation about the life of Moses while studying the Bible. This view assumes a broader definition of the words translator and translation. According to this view, Joseph's translation was not a literal rendering of the papyri as a conventional translation would be. Rather, the physical artifacts provided an occasion for meditation, reflection, and revelation. They catalyzed a process whereby God gave to Joseph Smith the revelation about the life of Abraham, even if that revelation did not directly correlate to the characters on the papyri. In other words, the Gospel Topics essay takes both approaches. It says it can either be the missing scrolls and the emphasis on the antiquitous ideas found in the Book of Abraham, which it also does, or it can also endorse the catalyst theory. And then it closes with what it says is the most important thing, which is the spiritual evidence. And this really frames the official institutional approach. Quote, the veracity and value of the Book of Abraham cannot be settled by scholarly debate concerning the book's translation and historicity. The book's status as scripture lies in the eternal truths it teaches and the powerful spirit it conveys. In other words, it offers these secular academic defenses as long as it's submissive to the testimony argument that they believe is at the heart of the scripture. Now, one can say that this essay is not as strong as the other Gospel Topics essays because it takes this schizophrenic approach of offering a variety of different apologetics rather than an overall argumentative case. But in the end, I think that is actually appropriate in this case because, as I mentioned, faithful Latter-day Saint scholars are divided over how to defend the Book of Abraham. So the Gospel Topics essays tries to go down the middle of the field, including all those theories and allowing Latter-day Saints to come to whatever conclusion they want, as long as that conclusion is buttressed by the spiritual witness of the eternal truths found in the Book of Abraham. All right, I hope you found this video useful. I will note that all these sources that I quoted and referenced you can find links to in the video description because I want you to go read them yourselves. I will note that I focused this video on the faithful apologetic approaches because I'm tracing this as a ideological lineage within the LDS tradition. You can assume that critics and scholars are going to disagree with a lot of these points, and I think their counter arguments are clear enough to where I don't need to highlight them too much. But at least within the LDS tradition, both these apologetic approaches, the antiquitous defense and missing scroll theory and the catalyst theory, now exist side by side, sometimes awkwardly, as found in the Gospel Topics essay. They represent the diverging perspectives on how Mormonism and its scriptural truths work, as well as disagreements over how one should defend the faith and how these scriptural truths should be interpreted and examined. How much fallibility are you going to give to Joseph Smith? How literal do you need to be in those interpretations? Those are broader scriptural and religious claims and issues that go far beyond just the Book of Abraham issue. Now, if you want to dig more into this, and I hope you do, I hope this is a catalyst, pun intended, to doing more research on your own, I have a few more links in the video description. As I mentioned in the previous video, Mormon R, the apologetic website, put together a really great collection of documents from all the different perspectives if you want to dig in on them. If you want the apologetic overall case, John Gee's book, An Introduction to the Book of Abraham, offers that type of approach. He's been among the foremost orthodox apologists for the antiquitous defense of the Book of Abraham. If you want more of the critical approach, Dan Vogel put out with Signature Books a number of years ago, Book of Abraham Apologetics, a review and critique. And just to be fair, a response to that was nearly as long as the book itself, came from Stephen Smoot, titled Framing the Book of Abraham, Presumptions and Paradigms, which appeared in the Mormon Apologist outlet, The Interpreter. I will link to that as well. History has never been more relevant than it is today, not just because this story is fascinating in its own right, and it certainly is that, but because at the heart of this issue are questions of scripture and apologetics and belief and orthodoxy that tell us a lot about how communities evolve, how they make sense of the world, and how those lingering issues remain. In other words, questions of humanity. And I hope that history helps provide a vantage point from which to interpret that. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, share with others, subscribe to the channel if you want more content, and become a member if you want to give back. History has never been more relevant, which is why these topics are so crucial.